Welcome to the Victorian era, where showing an ankle was treated like detonating a social bomb. One laugh too loud, or a skirt lifted an inch too high could apparently unravel the empire, and you won't believe the ridiculous lengths they went to keep their scandals under wraps. If you enjoy drifting off to stories where scandal lurked in every shadow of polite society, hit that like button and subscribe for more delightfully drowsy improprieties. This episode is part of our Victorian series, a cosy collection of bedtime stories exploring the most absurd, overblown, and eyebrow-raising taboos of the 19th century. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is, because there's something oddly soothing about falling asleep to tales of fainting aunts, fluttering fans, and catastrophically exposed toes. Now dim the lights, get cozy, and slip into a world where even the tiniest gesture could spark a scandal. You're just trying to walk across the street, that's it. No agenda, no scandal in mind. Just point A to point B with your groceries, and a passing respect for not face-planting in horse droppings. But the street is mud. Thick, clingy, ankle-deep sludge that's swallowed better boots than yours. So you do the unthinkable. You lift your skirt, just an inch, maybe two, and suddenly it's as if the clouds part and God himself leans down, clutching his pearls. You've exposed an ankle, an actual ankle. Flesh, shape, the forbidden curve of a woman's lower leg. And a man across the way drops his newspaper like he's seen the face of Satan in lace-up boots. The worst part? You didn't even do it with flair. There was no teasing, no silk stocking, no meaningful eye contact. Just one muddy street, one very functional shin, and now you're the subject of 5 neighbourhood rumours and at least one poem written in secret. Welcome to the Victorian era, where modesty is a moving target and your body is a walking moral crisis. Let's get this out of the way up front. The Victorians were not collapsing into seizures at the mere sight of a woman's ankle. Despite what the internet says, there were no mass faintings, no ankles so powerful they caused stampedes, and no police sketch artists summoned to document the horror of someone's exposed lower limb. But that doesn't mean ankles were entirely innocent. In fact, they occupied that glorious, ridiculous space between completely normal body part and potential threat to society. The idea that ankles were outrageously provocative has been heavily exaggerated over time, often by modern commentators looking to dunk on the past. Much of the ankle panic traces back to early 20th century books like Unmentionables from Fig Leaves to Scanties, 1933, which gleefully exaggerated Victorian modesty for laughs. The whole ankles cause chaos bit, mostly satire, repackaged over decades until it was accidentally believed. But the roots of this ridiculous myth are sort of grounded in reality. Victorian etiquette books did lay out firm instructions for when it was socially acceptable to lift your skirt. Muddy roads, for example, allowed for a brief controlled reveal just above the ankle. One hand only, no sudden movements, and God help you if you use both hands, which we'll get to later in the story. That was considered unladylike, which is Victorian for, we don't have a real reason, we just don't like it. What actually mattered wasn't the ankle itself, it was intent. A woman picking up her hem to avoid filth. Socially tolerable. A woman pulling her skirts aside slowly, deliberately, to expose a silk-stockinged ankle at a garden party. That, my friend, was filth incarnate. It wasn't the body part, it was the performance. Etiquette manuals didn't spend pages panicking over ankles. When mentioned at all, they usually just reminded readers to lift their skirts just enough to navigate the cobblestones, and for God's sake, don't look like you enjoy it. The real scandal came not from ankles, but from movement, posture, gesture, the sheer act of existing in a female body in public. Still, the well-turned ankle made frequent appearances in romantic fiction. Slender, delicate, nicely shaped ankles were shorthand for femininity, grace, and just a pinch of erotic potential. But they weren't the stuff of full-blown social collapse. Victorian men weren't clutching their chests and keeling over because someone dared to walk. And here's where class enters the chat. Working-class women, they didn't have time to coordinate every inch of skirt choreography. They lifted what they had to, wore practical clothes, and many even gasped wore pants for labour. If their ankles showed, so be it. They had bread to earn and 12 kids to wrangle. It was upper-class women, insulated by privilege and judged by every glance, who lived under constant surveillance, or even lifting a skirt for mud became a performance graded by strangers. So no, Victorians weren't universally scandalised by ankles, but they were obsessed with appearances, control and the fantasy of moral purity. And when you're selling that fantasy, you'll take any body part you can weaponize, even the one that connects the leg to the foot. Still, some environments made ankle watching more sport than scandal, like, say, the theatre. Because if you think a muddy road caused trouble, just wait until we add velvet seats, footlights, and a room full of men with opera glasses and very few boundaries. Shall we go in? So you go to the theatre, not to be scandalous. Oh no, but because you've spent the last 3 weeks eating boiled cabbage in a corset and pretending your opinions don't exist. You deserve some drama that doesn't involve your mother-in-law fainting over soup placement. You arrive fashionably on time, late, slide into your velvet seat with the grace of a bored duchess, and try to forget that your undergarments contain more steel than a shipyard. You're there for culture, for music, for art. What you're not there for is a man 3 boxes over with opera glasses pointed directly at your kneecaps like he's mapping unexplored terrain. At first you assume he's watching the show, then you shift slightly and so do the lenses. You cross your legs and they adjust again. You uncross your legs, they follow. You lean behind your fan and whisper to your friend, "Am I being hunted?" You are. The opera has barely started and your ankles are apparently upstaging the soprano. You glance around the theatre. More men, more glasses, all watching the performance, which happens to align perfectly with any woman who dares possess lower limbs. One lady in the next box adjusts her stocking and instantly causes 3 monocles to pop off in synchronized horror. You sit still, very still, but it's too late. Your ankles have entered society and someone out there just jotted your name down as bold. Now let's be clear, the Victorian theatre was a moral contradiction wrapped in a velvet curtain. On one hand, it was wildly popular. London's West End boomed. Regional theatres thrived. Families went. Politicians went. Even Queen Victoria had a private box. Theatre was the Netflix of the 19th century, just with more feathers and fewer content warnings. But on the other hand, it was the gateway to corruption, according to every evangelical newsletter printed between 1840 and 1899. Why? Because the stage was a rare and glorious place where women's ankles, and sometimes legs, were visible. Dancers, actresses, chorus girls twirling and leaping and, worst of all, moving freely. The horror. In 1866, one especially spicy production called The Black Crook debuted in New York and featured a chorus line of women in form-fitting tights. Audiences gasped, critics howled, tickets sold out, and the scandalous little ankles. They twirled their way into theatre history. But the real Victorian threat wasn't the women on stage, it was the women in the audience. Because once women started showing up to theatres regularly, especially in evening dress, read, more skin than usual, men discovered that the best view wasn't always the stage. It was row E, seat 7, directly in front of them. Hence, opera glasses. Now, in theory, opera glasses were for watching the performance. In practice, they became the Victorian male equivalent of zooming in with your phone camera under the guise of just checking the lighting. Creepily enhanced people watching disguised as culture, and since women in theatre boxes often crossed their legs, moved naturally or leaned forward, like humans, it became a silent sport to observe them with increasing precision. The press rarely mentioned it, but women certainly did. Diaries from the era contain plenty of side-eyed observations about curious gentlemen with lenses aimed slightly too low. Naturally, this horrified the same people who were already convinced the theatre was a hive of sin. Moral watchdogs, especially evangelical groups, regularly tried to shut down performances, citing indecency, ankle visibility, and inappropriate leg motions as evidence of the stage's descent into depravity. But here's the kicker. No one stopped going. If anything, attendance grew. Public outcry only made the performances more desirable. As one newspaper lamented in 1891, It is a great pity that so many young women frequent the playhouse and so many young men frequent the wrong parts of it. The Victorian theatre was a place of contradiction, where the rules relaxed just enough to make scandal possible, but not enough to make it safe, where morality met movement, and where women, whether they were lifting a hem to climb into a seat or daring to breathe in a satin bodice, became part of the spectacle. And if that wasn't enough to panic polite society, well, wait until you see what happens when a woman lifts her skirt with both hands, because apparently that was the line. You're just trying to get into a carriage. You've done it before, hundreds of times in fact. You know the routine. Step up, turn slightly, maintain grace. Pray you don't trip over the hem and flash someone your upbringing. But today, you hesitate. The street is wet. The step is high. The carriage is absurdly designed by someone who's never worn layers. And so, in a moment of pure desperation, you do it. You grab your skirt with both hands. Gasps ripple through the air. Somewhere a vicar drops his tea. A governess clutches her pearls and mutters, "Well, I never," even though she clearly just did. The coachman looks away as if to say, "I didn't see that. I didn't see you. Congratulations. You didn't just reveal your ankles, yeah, you revealed intent. And in Victorian society, intent is filthier than nudity." To the modern eye, lifting one's skirt with two hands seems like a logistical choice. More control, less mud, fewer tragic pratfalls. But to Victorian etiquette experts, it was anarchy disguised as practicality. Etiquette books of the time were obsessed with how women lifted their skirts. Not whether you did, because of course you had to avoid puddles, dust, manure, and the occasional aggressively placed cabbage leaf, but how you did it. One hand, graceful, reserved, feminine. Two hands. You might as well shout, "Look at me! I have knees!" The 1893 guide, The Etiquette of Good Society, written with the righteous vigour of someone who has never climbed stairs in 3 petticoats, gently warns women that it is not customary to pick up one's skirt with both hands as the effect is vulgar. Vulgar, of course, being code for any behaviour that implies you're comfortable inside your own body. The logic here, and we're using the term generously, is that lifting with two hands exposes too much. More movement, more leg shape, more potential. It transforms a functional adjustment into an act of public exhibitionism. You weren't accidentally showing an ankle. You were controlling the reveal. And in Victorian society, that made it your fault. Even worse, it blurred class lines. Upper-class women were trained to move like sculptures, still slow, elegant, and preferably surrounded by at least 3 layers of ruffles. Two-handed skirt lifting looked suspiciously like something a servant might do. Quick, efficient, practical, poor. And so, like many things in the Victorian era, the scandal wasn't always about the act itself. It was about what the act implied. A two-handed skirt lift suggested physical freedom, boldness, the ability to say, "Excuse me, I am going to step over this mud pile without breaking my neck or my social standing." And that kind of self-determination, terrifying. It's also worth noting that skirts in the 19th century weren't exactly whisper-light. With multiple layers, bustles and hidden pockets, which sometimes contained entire sandwiches, it was often physically easier to lift with both hands. But etiquette didn't care about physics. Etiquette cared about optics, especially the optics of womanhood as something fragile, delicate, and preferably incapable of doing anything without permission. And so, a generation of women learned to pinch fabric daintily between 2 fingers, hoist it half an inch, and pray they didn't land face first in a puddle, because someone in a top hat decided ladylike meant physically doomed. Of course, working-class women didn't have this problem. They lifted however they needed because their lives didn't involve tea schedules and social panic. Their goal was to survive the day, not maintain posture while dying of pneumonia. But for those under constant scrutiny, the rules were relentless. Don't speak too loudly, don't laugh too hard, don't lift your skirt with both hands, or you might just signal that you're comfortable, capable, or worse. Interesting. And if that wasn't enough to keep you in line, remember, sometimes you didn't even have to move your skirt to scandalize someone. Sometimes, all it took was taking off your gloves and revealing, brace yourself, your wrist. You're at a dinner party, one of those dreadful social obligations where no one can hear the string quartet over the sound of passive aggression. The roast is dry. The conversation is drier, and the woman next to you just spent 10 minutes describing her embroidery technique like she's applying for sainthood. You're sweating through 16 layers of wool and respectability. It's stifling. The fire's roaring. The candles are blazing. The footman keeps refilling your sherry glass like he's trying to drown you politely. And your wrists, your poor, delicate, scandalous wrists, are suffocating inside gloves that feel like they're made from disappointment and horsehair. So, against your better judgment, you do it. You unbutton one glove, slowly, then the other. You slide them off like you're peeling a banana you're not supposed to be touching. The silk clings. Your fingers flex. It is, unfortunately, the most sensual thing that has happened in this house since someone moistened a scone in 1842. You think nothing of it, until you glance up. The room has gone silent. A man 3 chairs down drops his spoon into his consommé. Someone coughs into a doily. The hostess looks at your bare wrists like you just flung your corset across the table and demanded the beef course in Latin. And just like that, you're a harlot, a wrist harlot, a bare-knuckled Jezebel who dared to air out her joints in mixed company. No one is eating dessert tonight. It sounds absurd now, and to be fair, it was a bit absurd then too. But the Victorian era had a genuine fixation on the wrist. Slender, delicate, just provocative enough to make men drop their monocles and women tighten their corsets. In public, a woman's wrists were usually covered. Gloves weren't just accessories, they were armour. To remove them at the wrong time or in the wrong place wasn't simply a fashion faux pas. It was a social gamble. There were rules, of course. Glove removal was permitted under strict conditions, indoors, in private, and preferably while being silently judged by at least 3 people. At the dinner table, for example, you were allowed to remove your gloves before eating, but only after the host did so first. Get it wrong, and someone might assume you're about to flirt, or worse, have opinions. Etiquette manuals laid it out clearly. In the Ladies' Book of Etiquette and Manual of Politeness, 1872, Florence Hartley advises, "It is not necessary to wear gloves at the table, although they should be worn into the dining room and removed quietly when you are seated." Quietly, being the key word. No dramatic ungloving unless you're planning to duel the dessert. But why all this drama over wrists? Because like ankles, the wrist was a symbol, not just a body part. It hinted at femininity, delicacy, sexuality by suggestion. The wrist was alluring because it was usually hidden, not inherently erotic, but erotically off-limits. Show it, and you weren't just bearing skin. You were bearing intent. Even worse. The act of removing gloves was to some eyes seductive in itself. Think about it. Slow movements, focus on the hands, the gentle reveal of pale skin. It was basically the Victorian version of a striptease, only with fewer strings and more disapproval. And if you happened to have slender, graceful wrists, oh no, that was an asset, a dangerous one. Men commented on it in letters and novels. Artists painted them lovingly. A well-turned wrist might inspire poetry. A poorly timed reveal? Public disgrace. The paradox, as always, was exhausting. Women were expected to be alluring, but not on purpose. Attractive, but not aware. And if your wrists betrayed you by existing in public light, well, that was a risk society wasn't willing to forgive. Of course, working women wore shorter sleeves all the time. They didn't have time for full glove protocol while scrubbing staircases or hauling laundry. But the judgment didn't apply to them the same way, just as the invitation to dinner didn't. For the middle and upper classes, where visibility meant reputation, your wrists became part of your social resume. Controlled, quiet, modest, preferably covered in lace. And yet, for all this delicate drama over gloves and wrists, society still found itself increasingly aroused and outraged. So the question became, if furniture legs were being ogled, wrists were ticking time bombs, and ankles caused spontaneous moral collapse, what could possibly be left? Oh, right, the piano. Brace yourself. Because we're about to scandalise a chair. You're in a drawing room politely pretending not to hate everyone. The conversation has shifted from wallpaper to Anglican morality, a natural progression, and you've been sipping tepid tea while considering whether death by doily suffocation would be less tedious than this gathering. Across the room sits a grand piano, regal, mahogany, innocent, or so you thought. Suddenly someone gasps. You follow their gaze, and there it is, a bare leg. Not yours, the piano's, smooth, unblushing, brazenly arched like it's trying to seduce the ottoman. You didn't even notice it before, but now you can't unsee it. That polished curve, that shapely foot, that shameless scroll work. It's practically winking at you. Someone rushes to drape a velvet cloth over it. Scandal averted. You're safe once more from the corrupting influence of furniture. Ah, yes, the infamous piano leg panic. Possibly the most enduring, most ridiculous and most misunderstood myth about Victorian modesty. According to the legend, Victorians were so deeply scandalised by the resemblance of piano legs to women's legs that they began covering them with little skirts. Because nothing says moral decency like playing Chopin next to a draped table that looks like it's going to prom. This myth has been repeated everywhere. From dinner parties to documentaries to online memes featuring fainting couches and quotes like, "A gentleman must never gaze upon a carved leg unless it belongs to a chicken. There's just one problem. It's not true, or at least, not in the way people think." The idea that Victorians earnestly covered their piano legs out of sexual terror is a classic case of historical telephone. The earliest references to such furniture modesty were satirical, not sincere. Victorian writers and cartoonists loved mocking prudishness, and covering piano legs became the perfect punchline. Matthew Sweet, in his book Inventing the Victorians, goes after this myth with a crowbar. There is no evidence that the custom was ever practiced in the period, except as a means of protecting valued furniture from damage. In much the same way antimacassars defended upholstery from dirt and hair cream. In other words, the skirts were for dust, not lust. But oh, did the myth catch on, especially in the early 20th century when people were desperate to paint the Victorian era as laughably repressed. The Roaring Twenties loved nothing more than dragging their corseted ancestors through a sea of mockery. And the piano leg story was just too delicious to fact-check. Still, it's easy to see how the tale stuck. After all, the Victorians were obsessed with modesty. And they did live in a world where the female body was simultaneously idolised, policed, and never to be discussed unless you were diagnosing it with hysteria. So when someone joked that table legs were too sexy, it didn't sound that implausible. Also, legs were tricky territory. Even the word leg was sometimes considered improper, hence the popularity of euphemisms like limb. And yes, that includes furniture limbs. So while people might not have been fainting at the sight of a piano foot, they did occasionally refer to it like it was something that needed a chaperone. So what was actually covered? Furniture was often draped, but usually for practical reasons, to protect from dust, sun damage, or sweaty Victorian humans. Antimacassars were placed on chairs to guard against men's hair oil. Dining tables were covered because food is messy. And yes, occasionally decorative skirts adorned pianos, but not because they were causing arousal. It's hard to be seduced by an inanimate object when you're trying not to die from diphtheria. Still, this myth says more about us than it does about them. We want the Victorians to be absurdly prudish, so we can laugh at their hang-ups while pretending ours are better. But scandal didn't stop at the parlour. Oh no. Because if you think piano legs were indecent, just wait until you see what happened when a woman went to the beach, wearing 14 pounds of wool. You've been invited to the seaside, for health of course, not for pleasure, certainly not for fun, definitely not to enjoy yourself. Just a brisk bracing splash in the frigid waters of shame to cure your nerves, clear your skin, and spiritually disappoint your ancestors. So you pack accordingly. Parasol, smelling salts, 12 layers of fabric, and one carefully pre-folded towel you're not allowed to use. Upon arrival, you're informed that swimming is far too modern and scandalous. No, you will be bathing, like a Victorian tea bag. You're ushered into a bathing machine, which is basically a moral panic on wheels, a small wooden box dragged into the ocean by either a horse or the ghost of your dignity. Inside, you change into your bathing costume, a full wool dress with sleeves, pantaloons, built-in weights, and a design best described as wet tablecloth meets tactical disadvantage. As you emerge from your mobile shame unit, the salt air hits you. So does the realization that you're being watched by a fully clothed man whose job title is Modesty Inspector, which somehow still pays better than your cousin's job at the bank. You descend into the water, gasping as icy waves collide with 14 pounds of righteous fabric. You are now floating, barely, like a soggy Victorian ghost trying not to scandalize a seagull. And through it all you think, this is the most modest I have ever been. This is also the closest I have ever come to drowning. God forbid I flash an elbow and cause a riot. Victorian beach modesty was less about swimming and more about not dying of embarrassment in public. Let's start with the basics. Women didn't really swim in the modern sense. Swimming implied movement, freedom, limbs, all deeply suspicious things. Instead, women were expected to bathe, float gently, assisted by ropes, maids, or divine intervention. And to do this, they wore bathing costumes, full-body ensembles made of wool, the very fabric most likely to absorb 30 pounds of water and drag you to the seafloor like a soggy martyr. These outfits often included a high-necked blouse, a skirt with weight sewn into the hem so it wouldn't float up and cause mayhem, bloomers, stockings, bath shoes, and sometimes even corsets because God forbid your waist betray you at low tide. Enter the bathing machine, a wheeled windowless box dragged into the sea by horses or unfortunate humans. Women would step inside on the shore, change into their aquatic armour, and be rolled into the ocean like shame-filled barrels. They'd descend the steps into the water discreetly, far from the prying eyes of men, or at the very least behind a curtain of social anxiety. But that wasn't enough. To ensure no scandal slipped through the cracks, or skirts, some beaches employed modesty officers, men whose job was to stand around, fully clothed, and make sure the bathing women didn't flash an ankle or exude joy. Imagine being paid to stare at people and yell "too much fun" every time someone floated too vigorously. Meanwhile, men were allowed to bathe shirtless, eventually. But even that took time. Early on, men also wore full bathing suits, until their freedom to bare chests emerged like a sunburned revolution. And in many places, segregated bathing hours were enforced, because if a man saw a woman wet and upright at the same time, he might simply implode. Yet despite all this effort, the machines, the wool, the wardrobe changes, the beach still sparked moral panic. Women were getting too comfortable. They were laughing, splashing, possibly enjoying themselves. Worse, seaside resorts became hubs for unsupervised mingling. The horror. In 1892, the Graphic published an illustration mocking overly restrictive beachwear, featuring a woman wrapped in what looked like curtains struggling to walk while the caption read, "Perfectly safe from temptation and movement." The Victorians had turned a day at the beach into an Olympic event in repression. But underneath all that wool, people were still people. Women flirted, couples strolled, and in the privacy of hired bathing machines, more than a few stories began that would never appear in etiquette books. Of course, modesty didn't just weigh down women at the beach. It followed them home, into their parlours, their ballrooms, their beds, and perhaps no piece of clothing captured the contradictions of Victorian womanhood, the morality, the desire, the control. Quite like the corset. You're being laced, not dressed, not gently assisted. Laced, like a roast, like a regrettable ham, like a Victorian crime scene that ends with someone passing out in a chair they can't sit in. One maid pulls the corset strings, the other braces her foot against the dresser like she's launching a cannon. You clutch the bedpost and consider writing a will with the last bits of lung function you'll ever know. By the third yank, your spine has reintroduced itself to your earlobes, and your waist has shrunk to the circumference of a firm grapefruit. Breathing? Optional. Digestion? Cancelled. Emotional stability? Gone. But you look incredible. A single bead of sweat rolls down your temple. The maid calls it glow. You call it a cry for help. You try to speak, but only manage a faint wheeze that sounds like someone stepping on a flute. You nod instead, the universal sign for, "Yes, I'm fine," and also, "Please notify my next of kin." But it's worth it, because now, finally, you're ready for society. You can't sit, you can't bend. You've lost all peripheral vision. But you, madam, are a vision of virtue, a perfect hourglass filled with anxiety and 87% internal rearrangement. The Victorian corset was not just a garment, it was an institution, a structure, a lifestyle, a declaration of morality wrapped in whalebone and judgment. It was praised, it was condemned, it was fetishized, it was feared, and above all it was everywhere. Corsets shaped not just bodies but reputations. A cinched waist was a sign of refinement, elegance and discipline, the holy trinity of Victorian womanhood. But of course, the tighter the waist, the louder the moral panic. Doctors warned that corsets crushed internal organs. Clergymen claimed they strangled the soul. One newspaper in 1868 called the corset a prison for vanity, while another praised it for protecting women from ungodly slouching. The confusion was constant. Were corsets elegant or evil, feminine or fatal, sexy or satanic? The answer was yes. Corset design varied wildly over the century. Early Victorian styles were stiff and conical, flattening the bust and shaping the torso like an upright coffin. By the mid-1800s, the silhouette softened into the famous hourglass, still deadly, but now with curves. And by the late 19th century, corsets were long line, heavily boned, and designed to reshape the entire torso, not just the waist. Advertisements promoted corsets for every occasion: riding corsets, evening corsets, nursing corsets, maternity corsets, yes, really, and even sanitary corsets, which presumably made you less filthy while slowly killing you. There were corsets made of silk, cotton, denim and steel. Some featured front busks, others were lace only, some cost a week's wages, others were mass-produced and sold in department stores with all the glamour of a well-packaged death trap. The truth is, most women wore corsets daily, but not all to the extreme degree we imagine. Yes, tight-lacing existed, especially among the fashionable elite. But most everyday corsets were worn for support, posture, and societal pressure, not to collapse one's lungs for fun. Still, the visual ideal of the tiny waist dominated Victorian media. Women's magazines published waist reduction routines. Etiquette books emphasized the well-proportioned figure. And some beauty guides included instructions for lacing that read more like a survival manual than fashion advice. Meanwhile, men had opinions. So many opinions. Some were scandalized, claiming corsets were deceptive, optical illusions of virtue. Others were obsessed, writing poetry about women whose waists could be encircled with their hands, which, to be clear, says more about their hand size than anything else. And of course, corsets were blamed for everything. Fainting, corset; hysteria, corset. Infertility, scoliosis, rebellious thoughts, the slow decline of empire. Corset, 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 corset. But here's the fun twist. Corsets were also powerful. They gave structure. They offered security. Some women loved them. Others hated them. Many had complicated ongoing relationships with them, much like modern women have with shapewear, high heels, or anything marketed as seamlessly sculpting. The corset was not inherently evil, but the world built around it, the one that judged women by waistline, breath control, and spine rigidity, that was the real trap. And it didn't end at the corset, because even if you survived the lacing, the fainting, the organ relocation, and the unsolicited sonnets, you still had to look at yourself in the mirror and not feel like a moral failure. And that, frankly, was the hardest part. You glance in the mirror, just a peek, a flicker, a quick check to make sure your eyebrow hasn't migrated south during the sermon. But then it happens. You see yourself. Not just the vague outline of your bangs and despair, no. You see your full face, the curve of your cheek, the delicate line of your jaw. And for one horrifying second you think, not bad. Congratulations. You're now a cautionary tale. You look away, panicked. Too late. Your great-aunt saw you. So did the maid. Somewhere in the distance, a clergyman gasps and drops his Bible. A neighbour's monocle shatters in his tea. A horse collapses. You just made direct eye contact with your own beauty, and now the entire social order is unravelling. Someone throws a doily over the mirror. Someone else throws a doily over you. You are now the Jezebel of the guest bedroom. The wanton siren of the vanity table, the hussy who dared to smirk slightly at herself while adjusting her hatpin. and you were doing so well. In the long list of things Victorian women weren't supposed to enjoy, food, air, opinions, beauty ranked uncomfortably high, specifically their own. It wasn't that women weren't expected to be beautiful, quite the opposite. They were expected to be effortlessly, unconsciously, and eternally beautiful, in the exact same way roses are expected to bloom, quietly, submissively, and preferably without knowing what they look like. To actively acknowledge your appearance, to smile at your own reflection, to like it. That was vanity. And vanity was a sin. Victorian literature warned constantly of women who noticed themselves too much. They were always the ones who ended up abandoned, disgraced, dead in a ditch, or worse, French. Even mirrors were suspect. A modest woman did not linger in front of them. She used them briefly to adjust her hair, check for crumbs, confirm she had not been possessed, and then moved on. Anything more than a passing glance was a slippery slope to narcissism, scandal, and the immediate destruction of society. Etiquette manuals of the time were full of warnings. One 1884 guide insisted that a woman who spent too long in front of a mirror revealed a dangerous self-absorption, unbecoming of feminine virtue. In other words, if you made eye contact with your reflection and didn't immediately burst into tears of humility, you were a harlot. Of course, this didn't apply to other people looking at you. Men were absolutely encouraged to appraise women like fruit at a questionable market stall. Artists could paint you, strangers could comment, husbands could criticize. But if you looked at yourself and thought, not bad, you were basically reenacting Eve and the apple, but with better posture. This hypocrisy bled into advertising. Victorian beauty products were sold under the guise of health, cleanliness, and morality. Tooth powders and skin creams promised purity and brightness, never sex appeal. Rouge was complexion enhancer. Hair dye was restorative tonic. Eyeliner didn't exist because nothing says fallen woman like having visible eyelashes. And still, women found ways to sneak in a little vanity. A longer gaze here, a hidden mirror there, a pocket-sized compact used quickly between disapproving stares. The desire to look nice, and know it, was persistent, even if it had to be disguised as just making sure I don't look ill and possessed. The reality, vanity wasn't the problem. Visibility was. A woman could be beautiful, even admired, so long as she never acted like she knew. Because the moment she became aware of her power, she became dangerous. A woman in a corset was a symbol. A woman who liked how she looked in a corset, a threat. And speaking of dangerous things, let's say, hypothetically, that you left the house one day, that you wandered into a garden, and that behind a hedge, away from the parlour eyes and lace-curtained judgment, you kissed someone. Oh no, you didn't just admire yourself, you acted on it. You kissed someone, not in church, not during a formal waltz with at least 3 aunts watching, not even under Queen Victoria's cold, judgmental portrait. No, you kissed someone behind a hedge, and not just any hedge. The scandal hedge, the one next to the rose arbour where reputations go to die. It's brief, barely a moment. A soft whispered oops of a kiss that would barely qualify as affectionate in modern-day Denmark. But in Victorian society, it might as well have been a full-blown bacchanalian orgy with live musicians and pie. Your lips part, your heart races. The birds stop singing. Somewhere nearby, a spinster drops her lorgnette into a teacup. You brush a leaf from your sleeve and emerge from the shrubbery looking like you've just survived both passion and botany. You are flushed. You are glowing. You are doomed. Because even though no one saw it, everyone knows. You smiled when you returned to the garden path. Your bonnet is slightly off-centre, and worst of all, someone heard a rustle. That's all it takes. A whisper, a glance. A single rose petal out of place, and boom, you are officially no longer fit to marry anyone who owns silverware. Public displays of affection in the Victorian era were a bit like playing emotional minesweeper. One wrong move and boom, social obliteration. While married couples were expected to at least pretend to like each other, unmarried folks were expected to behave as if physical attraction was a myth invented by the French. Kissing, especially outside of marriage, was considered wildly improper, unless you were a character in a serialized novel, in which case it was fine as long as you died tragically afterwards. But let's be honest, people were still kissing. A lot. Behind hedges, in dark hallways, in carriages that hit a suspicious number of potholes. The difference was they were doing it in secret, not because it was illegal, but because it was scandalous, and scandal, in Victorian society, was worse than sin. At least sin could be confessed. Scandal stuck to your shoes. Etiquette books warned against lingering touches, familiar glances, and anything that might imply you had lips and used them recreationally. A respectable young lady was expected to remain chaste, demure, and entirely unaware of the mechanics of kissing until approximately 3 seconds after marriage. Romantic fiction didn't help. Novels of the time were bursting with stolen kisses, forbidden passion, and accidental hand touches so erotic they required a lie-down. Readers devoured them, and occasionally used them as instruction manuals. One woman reportedly used the air of Redcliffe to teach herself what leaning in looked like. And yet, no matter how frequently it occurred, a kiss still had consequences. If you were seen kissing someone, even once, your entire future could be derailed. You might be deemed fast, spoiled, or no longer fit for respectable marriage, especially if the kisser in question had no intention of proposing afterward. This, of course, was entirely your fault. Because women, as everyone knows, control both morality and atmospheric humidity with their emotions. Newspapers and gossip columns gleefully reported on kissing scandals, often with the tone of someone both outraged and taking notes. Headlines included phrases like improper familiarity at Vauxhall Gardens or incident behind the conservatory, which sounds like the title of a trashy Victorian romance, and, in fairness, probably was. And let's not forget the carriage kiss, a particular favourite of the wealthy and determined. Carriages offered privacy, speed, and just enough jostling to plausibly deny everything. It wasn't a kiss, Your Grace. The wheel caught a rut and I was thrown directly into his mouth. But despite all the rules, the social peril, and the wilting gardenias, people kept kissing. Because no matter how many books warned against it, or how many chaperones pretended not to notice, desire is not good at following instructions. Still, most didn't get caught. They were careful, discreet, strategic. They left no evidence behind. Well, almost no evidence. Because the next day you did something even riskier than kissing. You left a calling card, folded at the corner, and everyone knew what that meant. You leave a calling card, a completely innocent piece of cardstock, harmless, flat, embossed with your name in a font so delicate it could faint under pressure. You tell yourself this is normal, civilized, respectable, but then you fold the corner just a little, a slight crease, a subtle curve of flirtation, a whisper of "I was here," followed immediately by the echoing scream of "she folded it," somewhere deep in the soul of the household. Because in Victorian society you've just committed the social equivalent of launching a cannon into the parlour and proposing marriage to the footstool. The butler sees the card. He freezes. He's seen this before, once, in 47. It ended in scandal, exile, and a broken teacup. He carries it to the mistress of the house like it's leaking arsenic. The lady of the house reads the name, sees the fold, gasps. She drops the card, then drops the tray. Then drops dead, probably, but we'll never know. The scene cuts to black. And all because you couldn't leave a flat piece of cardboard alone. You had to crease it. You had to imply things. God help you if you ever send a note, or worse, a second card. Calling cards in the Victorian era were like a Tinder profile, a business card, and a social landmine all in one. They weren't just decorative. They were messages, carefully coded, painfully specific, and absolutely loaded with unspoken rules, each more convoluted than the last. Every respectable household had a silver tray by the front door, not for snacks, but for reputations. When you visited someone, or pretended to, you left a calling card. If they liked you, they sent one back. If they didn't, they mysteriously weren't home for the rest of your natural life. The cards themselves were tiny marvels, engraved fonts, filigree, elegant paper stock that whispered, "I belong to someone with opinions about tea strainers." But it wasn't the cardstock that got you into trouble, it was how you folded it. Top right corner folded, you dropped by in person. Bottom left, you're leaving a condolence. No fold at all. You're pretending to be emotionally neutral, but everyone knows you're mad. Folded just a little too seductively, you're asking for trouble and possibly inheritance. In the hands of a Victorian woman, a calling card could be an invitation, a rejection, a declaration of war, or a subtle hint that someone's waistline had gotten suspiciously large since the last musicale. And of course, there were rules. So many rules. You didn't hand someone your card directly unless you were trying to propose or duel. You didn't leave a card if you'd already left one that week, unless they hadn't answered it, in which case you now had to pretend it was a new card. You didn't call too soon, too late, too often, or on Sundays unless you were a close friend or a socially accepted nuisance. And if you were a man leaving a card for a woman, well, that little rectangle of paper carried more weight than a marriage proposal, especially if your visit wasn't exactly, let's say, chaperoned. A card left after an encounter of the hedge variety could be interpreted as everything from deepest apologies to meet me in the greenhouse, third pot from the left. Naturally, calling cards became the perfect cover for secret affairs. While the world thought you were just maintaining polite social habits, you were actually arranging rendezvous through folded paper like a romantic spy. Some lovers even used fake names, decoy cards, or borrowed friends' addresses to avoid suspicion. Of course, things occasionally went wrong. In one real-life scandal, a London woman mistakenly delivered a calling card with a folded corner, meant for her suitor, to her mother's closest friend, resulting in a week-long social migraine and a cancelled engagement. The card was retrieved only after 2 footmen and a confused poodle were interrogated. In short, Victorian society managed to take a 2x3-inch rectangle of paper and turn it into a moral Rubik's Cube wrapped in linen gloves, because nothing was too small to be scandalous, not kisses, not ankles, not wrists, and certainly not paper. But if you think calling cards were risky, just wait until you step into a ballroom and accept the hand of a stranger, for a dance so improper, so intimate, so wildly inappropriate. It involved touching and spinning. You dance the waltz. You don't mean to. It just happens. One moment you're politely sipping watered-down punch, avoiding conversation with a man who breeds asparagus competitively, and the next, a gloved hand is extended. A string quartet begins to play. Your corset tightens itself out of fear. You place your hand in his. He places his hand on your waist, your actual waist, the one you've spent 3 hours compressing into the width of a dinner roll. Then he turns you. You spin. He spins. Society spins. The room collectively stops breathing. You're now turning in public, in time with music, while touching a man without divine supervision. You make it halfway around the ballroom before scandal detonates in slow motion. Someone coughs violently into a doily. Your great-aunt grips a chair and says, "It's happening." A widow faints into the custard. A young lady watching from the sidelines suddenly knows what sin is. Meanwhile, you keep spinning, face flushed, hair dislodging, brain screaming, "I'm going to hell, and also I love this." You're no longer simply a guest at a ball. You are the romantic downfall of an entire county. And you are having an unacceptably good time. The waltz didn't just spin into English ballrooms. It barreled in like a scandal on wheels. When it arrived in the early 1800s from Germany and Austria, the waltz was immediately considered suspicious. Why? Because it involved things Victorians weren't emotionally prepared for: touching, spinning, and the possibility of seeing someone's ear. Traditional English dances involved formations, minimal touching, and lots of space between partners, ideal for pretending you had no limbs or feelings. But the waltz demanded proximity. You were in each other's personal space for an entire song, with hands placed on actual bodies, eyes locked like dueling pistols, and no opportunity for a moral escape route. It was called voluptuous, dangerous, un-English, and, this is real, a gateway to moral decay and sore ankles. Publications warned against it. Critics howled. Clergy fumed. One 1816 editorial described it as the indecent foreign dance, and by the 1830s one letter to the Times decried the waltz as an obscene display of feminine weakness. But people loved it anyway, which of course made it worse, because nothing says improper in Victorian society like popularity mixed with pelvic alignment. Ballroom etiquette tried to contain it. Strict rules were issued. No spinning too enthusiastically. No prolonged hand-holding. No cheek proximity under 4 inches. And absolutely no expressive faces during the 3rd rotation. Still, the damage was done. The waltz had already become the forbidden thrill of the dance floor. It was the slow burn. The flirtation that could pass as tradition. A fully sanctioned, lace-covered excuse to touch another human being and pretend you were just keeping time. And yet, in public, people still pretended to be scandalized. They shook their heads. They raised their eyebrows. They told their daughters, not until you're older, and only with someone who owns land. But in private, they danced. They touched. They spun like the floor might disappear. Even Queen Victoria, moral mascot of the empire, was known to enjoy the waltz. She wrote fondly in her journals of dancing with Albert, and no one batted an eye because monarchs can apparently caress with impunity. And so, like everything else in the Victorian world, corsets, calling cards, kissing in hedges, the waltz became a paradox. Romantic, risky, respectable if performed correctly, and socially catastrophic if you looked like you were enjoying it. But still, people danced, and when they weren't dancing, they were reading about it, or dreaming about it, or writing down the names of everyone who danced it more than twice in one evening, so they could discuss it later over tea cakes and strategic judgment. Because nothing kept Victorian society spinning quite like shame. Speaking of shame and love, and things one should not do in public or private, what happens when you find a novel that makes you feel things? No, not the Bible, a kissing book, and you read it. On purpose. You're reading, not scripture, not etiquette, not on the moral perils of laughter and girls over 15. No, you're reading fiction. And worse, it's romantic, and even worse than that. It has a kissing scene on page 94, and you just read it twice. You're alone in the drawing room, curled up like a morally ambiguous cat, pretending you're just improving your mind. But you're not. You're gripping the book like it contains forbidden spells. Your cheeks are flushed. Your posture is sinful. A single gloved hand is hovering mid-air like it doesn't know where to land. The couple in the book kisses behind a curtain, in a library, and no one faints or immediately gets married. They just enjoy it. You exhale, loudly, then immediately panic. Did someone hear that? You slam the book shut and hide it under a throw pillow, like it's a loaded pistol that just went off in your soul. You stare at the tea tray with the haunted look of someone who's been emotionally compromised by dialogue. Your maid enters. You smile too wide. She squints. You ask for more tea. She asks if you're feverish. You say, "I'm fine." She doesn't believe you. You swear you'll never read again. But 5 minutes later, you're back under that pillow whispering, "Just one more chapter." Victorian women were absolutely obsessed with romantic fiction, and their critics were absolutely obsessed with pretending this was the end of civilization. Dubbed sensational novels, penny dreadfuls, and with increasing horror, kissing books, these stories were widely circulated, publicly condemned, and privately devoured. They featured bold heroines, smouldering heroes, surprise inheritance plots, suspiciously dramatic fainting spells, and, if you were lucky, a single kiss by page 312 that shattered your worldview. To moralists and social critics, this was dangerous. Why? Because the heroines had thoughts and desires, and flirted with men who didn't own land but did own feelings. These stories didn't always end in tragedy, or with a husband approved by 6 aunts and a bishop. Sometimes they ended with passion, agency, and at least one character unbuttoning something in the moonlight. Naturally, this led to widespread panic. Articles warned that romantic novels would rot your mind, inflate your expectations, and convince you that love should involve emotional connection. Shocking. One 1870 editorial warned that a young lady who consumes too many such tales may come to prefer excitement over virtue. Translation: she might say no to marrying her cousin the vicar. Parents tried to confiscate them. Teachers replaced them with Latin grammar books. Ministers denounced them from pulpits while secretly wondering what heated embrace meant. Meanwhile, publishers made a fortune. Books like The Heir of Redcliffe, East Lynne, and Lady Audley's Secret flew off the shelves. Libraries had wait lists. Young women traded copies under parasols like contraband. Some even wrote their own, swapping characters and endings and occasionally adding a second kiss. And of course, not all romantic fiction was dramatic. Some of it was genuinely subversive. These books offered women more than just romance. They offered imagination, escape, possibility. A glimpse at a life outside the parlour, the needlepoint, and the relentless pressure to become a charming corpse with a nice dowry. But even the tamest stories could trigger public pearl-clutching, because once a girl had read about a kiss that didn't come with a formal proposal and a third-party witness, who knew what she'd do next? She might kiss someone behind a hedge. She might waltz again. She might write a letter, with emotion and ink and a first name. Because if books could make you feel things, what else could they make you do? Which brings us, of course, to the final frontier of public impropriety. You went to the beach, you danced, you read a kissing book. But now, you do the unthinkable. You undress in a room full of other women at the bathhouse. You are naked. Well, not fully. Not yet. But you're in a bathhouse, which means you're on a slippery slope made of steam, anxiety, and a towel the size of a disappointed napkin. All around you, women are undressing like it's completely normal. Like they've never read a morality pamphlet in their lives. Corsets hit the floor, petticoats pile up like snowdrifts of shame. Someone laughs, while removing her stockings. You try to look at anything that isn't human skin. You fail. Then it's your turn. You unhook your corset with the trembling hands of a woman about to commit tax fraud. Your chemise clings like it knows this is your downfall. You step into the steam room and immediately regret your entire lineage. Within seconds, you're surrounded by limbs, freckles, elbows. Someone is exfoliating with oats. Another woman is casually discussing liver pudding recipes while scrubbing her armpits with a loofah the size of your shame. You sit down cautiously. The bench is damp, so is your soul. You try to join the conversation, but you're not sure how to casually say, "Lovely weather we're having. Please ignore that I can see your entire leg." At one point, someone makes eye contact. Direct eye contact. You may never recover. You came here for cleanliness. You've left with psychological mildew, and you still haven't figured out what to do with your hands. Victorian bathhouses were not the private, serene spa experiences modern minds might imagine. They were hot, awkward, and dangerously close to communal feminism. Women of all classes used bathhouses, especially in cities where personal plumbing was optimistic. While wealthy ladies might have clawfoot tubs and heated tile floors, the average Victorian woman bathed in a tin tub once a week while being judged by furniture and God. Bathhouses offered an upgrade: warm water, real soap, towels, and, most scandalously, other women doing the exact same thing, with their arms exposed and their hair unpinned, laughing like sirens who'd rejected society and embraced personal hygiene. The horror. Now, bathhouses were segregated by sex, of course. Co-ed bathing was reserved for ancient Rome and modern scandal novels. But even the sight of other women in various states of undress was enough to cause alarm bells to ring in certain corners of the moral universe. Critics warned that communal bathing might lead to excessive self-comfort, vanity, or, worst of all, conversations about things other than embroidery. There were fears that the bathhouse, much like reading novels or walking briskly, could awaken women to the radical idea that their bodies were not inherently shameful. Naturally, etiquette books tried to get involved. They suggested minimal talking, no laughter above a whisper, and absolutely no examining yourself in the mirror unless under duress or applying leeches. Modesty, even when naked, was crucial. One guide recommended wearing a bathing chemise, which sounds elegant until you realise it was basically a nightgown with poor life choices. But despite all this, the rules, the fear, the steam-induced judgment, bathhouses thrived. Because for many women, it was the only place they could truly relax, where the corset was gone, the hairpins were out, and for once, no one was asking them to embroider their feelings into a decorative handkerchief. They gossiped, they laughed, they soaked, and while the outside world clutched its pearls, the bathhouse quietly became one of the few places where women could just exist. Damp, unshaven, and gloriously unconcerned with being decorative. Of course, eventually you had to go back out, dry off, get dressed, reconstruct your silhouette, reassume your societal silence, repowder your sins, but just for a moment, you were free. And speaking of freedom, there was one final frontier of Victorian impropriety, a scandal so intimate, so shockingly personal, it was never spoken of above a whisper. You wore shoes, and people saw your feet, bare, at home, in front of family. You take off your shoes, not in secret, not in the dead of night with the curtains drawn and God temporarily distracted. No, you do it in the parlour, in front of actual people, like a lawless beast who thinks feet are for public consumption. Your boots hit the floor with a thud. Your stockings roll down. Your toes stretch, crack. Breathe the open air for the first time in 12 hours, and you sigh in relief. And that's when the screaming starts. Your aunt gasps so hard she swallows a sugar cube whole. The family dog whimpers and covers its eyes. A neighbour passing outside senses something unholy and immediately begins writing to the vicar. Somewhere upstairs a child faints without knowing why. You look down at your innocent toes still wiggling proudly and realise you've just revealed 10 tiny scandals at once. You aren't a daughter, you aren't a sister, you aren't a hostess, you're a barefoot harlot. And worse, you did it on the carpet. Victorians had a fraught relationship with feet, and not just because their shoes were stiff enough to double as blunt weapons. Feet were private, almost embarrassingly so. Stockings and boots weren't merely practical, they were a moral screen. To bare your foot was to bare your soul, and possibly your ankles, which was basically second base in the 19th century. Shoes were worn constantly, indoors, outdoors, during meals, during childbirth. Yes, really. Ladies' magazines warned that a woman removing her shoes in front of anyone but her maid risked appearing slovenly and improper. Men were not exempt. Socks were kept firmly on in polite society because nothing says romantic mood killer like pale toes under gaslight. Even within families, baring feet could be controversial. Domestic manuals advised young ladies never to be seen without footwear, lest the impression of indolence corrupt her household authority. Translation: if your kids ever saw your toes, they'd stop doing chores. Theatres and novels often used bare feet to signal degradation or low status, the sign of peasants, servants, or scandalous heroines who'd lost everything but their sense of dramatic timing. And yet, ironically, the fetishization of feet was alive and well. Artists lingered on dainty slippers, tiny feet, and delicately arched insteps as shorthand for femininity. Writers swooned over them. Advertisements for boots and stockings leaned heavily on their erotic potential, while pretending not to. So feet were simultaneously gross and sexy, everywhere and taboo. A paradox like most things in the Victorian world. Of course, working-class families didn't have the luxury of pearl clutching over toes. Poorer households went barefoot out of necessity, in factories, in fields, in crowded housing, and the upper classes shuddered not just at the nakedness, but at the reminder that poverty existed. Bare feet were shorthand for class shame, social failure, and everything rich Victorians wanted to pretend wasn't happening 2 streets away. And yet, in private, everyone had to unlace eventually. The boots came off, the stockings were rolled down, and for one scandalous moment toes touched air. But even in your own home, even surrounded by family, you weren't truly safe. Because while bare feet might be whispered about, judged, or mocked, the true scandal came when someone else noticed, and wrote it down, in the papers. Because if society couldn't handle toes, imagine what it did with public gossip, and you open the newspaper. Not for scandal, heavens no. You just want to see if Parliament has invented a new tax on breathing, or if another tonic has been marketed as cures headaches, gout, and possibly death. But then you see it, your name, in bold, on page 3. Young lady observed removing shoes during afternoon tea. Your toast falls from your hand, your tea curdles, your very soul detaches and hides under the settee. You flip the page, praying it's a misprint. It's not. Byline and all, complete with dramatic flair. The instep incident of Grosvenor Square. By noon, the butcher knows. By 2, your cousin in Bath knows. By dinner time, you've gone from eligible young lady to cautionary tale about podiatry. Your mother weeps. Your father sighs. The neighbours stare at you like you've single-handedly destroyed the British Empire with your bare toes. And the worst part? They spelled your name correctly, which means you're officially and very publicly ruined. By typeset. Victorian gossip columns were the social media of their day, fast, petty, often inaccurate, and absolutely devastating if your name appeared in them. From London society papers to small-town gazettes, columns gleefully reported on who danced too often, who smiled too broadly, and who was spotted with suspicious ankles in public. Entire reputations hinged on the throwaway sentence of a bored columnist, armed with ink and moral superiority. One misplaced word could undo years of carefully cultivated respectability. A whisper of impropriety, a laugh too loud, a carriage ride too late at night, became permanent record once it hit print. And unlike whispers, newspapers didn't fade. They were clipped, shared, saved, and passed around at breakfast tables like the world's first group chat. For women, the stakes were higher. A single mention of too familiar with a gentleman could derail a marriage prospect entirely. Men might shrug off gossip as rakish charm. Women were transformed into cautionary tales. A headline about a man leaving a supper party drunk might be shrugged off as boys will be boys. A headline about a woman laughing too much at that same supper. Moral decay at work. Satirical papers like Punch mocked society mercilessly, skewering fads, fashion and female behaviour with cartoonish glee. But other columns weren't jokes. They were weapons. Rivals planted stories. Families defended themselves in rebuttal. And scandals snowballed, even when they were based on nothing more than, say, someone sneezing with excessive enthusiasm at a musicale. The papers knew exactly what they were doing. Gossip sold. Outrage kept circulation high. And the more ridiculous the claim, the better. In one case, a woman's flirtatious manner was said to have caused her husband's business to fail. Another blamed a lady's loudly coloured dress for corrupting the youth of Brighton. So yes, one barefoot, one too many waltzes, one suspicious fold in a calling card. And suddenly you were column fodder. Ink-stained evidence of your downfall. And while men drank, gambled, and occasionally ran entire empires into the ground without much commentary, women lived in fear of paragraph-length assassinations in print. Still, society devoured it. Gossip columns weren't just news. They were entertainment. People clipped stories, laughed at them, tutted over them, and then secretly prayed they'd never end up in one themselves. But you know what? At least gossip in the papers could sometimes be ignored. What you couldn't ignore was gossip in the ballroom, whispered directly into someone's ear, punctuated with a fan, and amplified across the room faster than you could say ruined forever. Because next came the weaponization of conversation itself. You're at a ball. The chandeliers sparkle, the orchestra plays, the punch is suspiciously warm. You've survived every scandal so far, ankles, wrists, corsets, toes, and you think, surely nothing else can destroy me tonight. Then a woman next to you raises her fan. At first you think she's hot. Understandable. There are 200 people sweating in a room designed for 12. But no, this is not ventilation. This is communication. She flicks it once. Flutter. Snap. Tilt. And suddenly, she has just informed half the ballroom that Lady What's-Her-Name ran off with a piano teacher. Lord Who's-It has debts the size of Yorkshire, and you once adjusted your stockings too quickly at supper. You haven't spoken, you haven't moved. Yet within 30 seconds your reputation is shredded like cabbage at a coleslaw factory. You're undone by air circulation, a single breeze and you're finished. Victorians were masters of turning nothing into scandal, and nowhere was this more obvious than the language of the fan. Fans weren't just accessories, they were social weapons. With a flick, a snap, or a coy half-hide, women could signal everything from "meet me in the garden" to "you have spinach in your teeth." Whole guidebooks were printed explaining the secret codes of fan gestures. Some sincere, most satirical, but all equally terrifying if you were the subject of one. Even without an official dictionary, fans became shorthand for secrecy and scandal. Two women whispering behind one, dangerous. A sudden flutter during a dance, devastating. One diary from the 1850s described a ball where more reputations were ruined behind fans than on the dance floor. And of course, gossip didn't need accuracy, it only needed speed. The waltz might spin you once every 3 beats, but gossip could make 4 complete revolutions of a ballroom in under a minute. A rumour whispered behind a fan at supper could be halfway across London by morning. Newspapers often picked them up, dressed them in type, and gave them the permanence of print. But fans were faster and far deadlier. Because unlike print, whispered scandal left no evidence, only consequences. A young lady smiled too brightly at a dance. Fan flick. She's far too forward. A gentleman lingered too long in a conservatory. Fan snap. They were alone. You sneezed during grace. Fan flutter. Consumption. Doomed, the entire social world operated on fans, whispers, and collective paranoia. And that's the great joke of it all. It wasn't ankles or wrists or corsets or bare feet that truly scandalised the Victorians. It was each other. Their endless ability to police, judge, whisper, and inflate the smallest faux pas into an empire-ending disaster. Because at the end of the day, society wasn't destroyed by piano legs. It wasn't destroyed by ankles. It wasn't even destroyed by you reading a kissing book in the dark. It was destroyed by a room full of people whispering behind bits of lace, pretending they were better than the very scandals they lived for. So close your fan, dear listener. The ball is over. The candles are guttering. The gossip has already spread. And if you've made it this far, I can only assume one thing. You have the most scandalous ankles of them all. In the end, it wasn't ankles, wrists, corsets, or even the terrifying glimpse of a piano leg that doomed Victorian society. It was the endless game of pretending these things mattered at all. Behind the lace, the etiquette books, and the weaponized fans, Victorians were just as nosy, hypocritical, and delightfully ridiculous as we are now. They laughed. They whispered. They panicked over toes and gossip columns. And in doing so, they left us a legacy of scandal so absurd we can only laugh at it today. So the next time someone clutches their pearls over a modern outrage, just remember, at least no one fainted because you owned ankles. And now, as the last waltz fades and the parlour glows with the soft haze of gaslight and misplaced respectability, I hope this absurd little tour through Victorian scandals lingers, like the memory of a stockinged ankle glimpsed at the wrong moment. You've survived wrists that ruined reputations, piano legs too curvaceous for comfort, kisses behind hedges, gossip whispered behind fans, and enough etiquette rules to strangle a duchess. But for now, it's time to rest. The shoes are off, the corset strings are loosened, and the chaperones have finally fallen asleep in their chairs. If you're still awake, impressive. You've just made it through history's most delightfully overblown moral panic. Hit subscribe so we can scandalise another relic of the past tomorrow night. And as you drift, the soft crackle of the fire will carry you deeper, far from fluttering fans and fainting aunts, and into sleep.